and advise whoever wants to speak to stand up, please. And we will give you a microphone. Please just introduce yourself, your name. And it would be great if it's a question and if it's not a comment. If it's a comment, my apologies, I will interrupt. And we are trying to make all of this in time. I have actually 2 questions coming online, and I will give the floor. Chiara from Switzerland, she already asked, and I think we answered her question about what did you expect from this UN summit? Not much, I would say. But I would add, push your government to give a different response. Push them. You voted them, they work for you, and not for themselves. And Helen, from the Asia-Pacific Refugee Rights Network in Thailand, she would like to ask, what is the relevance of ratification of the 1951 Refugee Convention in the light of the crisis facing the world today? And if you would like to answer.
I think the reality is that the convention has been pretty undermined by what's going on, particularly in relation to the EU-Turkey deal, which we haven't talked about. But I think the general sense of that is that, you know, some of the fundamental principles of non-refoulement in particular have been challenged by the decision that Turkey is a safe third country. And even before the attempted coup, I think many people, certainly the people we interviewed, would have said that they didn't feel safe there for a whole variety of reasons, and that they didn't feel able to get protection or to rebuild their lives, because ultimately Turkey, as we know, retains the geographical limitation to the convention and therefore doesn't provide people with access to proper protection.
The fact that Turkey now will extend citizenship, is that a pleasant, or let's say, is that a positive development?
I think, first of all, that's not really happening.
Yeah,
I mean, plenty of things are said. There's always announcements. It's only Syrians. What about everybody else? I mean, I don't think there is a possibility of getting a work permit. When you talk to Syrians in Izmir and elsewhere, the reality of getting a work permit in Turkey is pretty slim. So I think it's easy to say things and more difficult to see that they're being delivered in practice.
And I think to add to that, it's not just EUTurkey where this refugee swap is happening, is the fact that this is being replicated in other countries. Is that these compacts, the EU is trying to take them elsewhere. I mean, with the Khartoum process, we see this happening with Sudan. So Sudan is being designated as a safe country. I'm assisting the all-party parliamentary group on Sudan. There is currently doing an inquiry between the UK engagement with Sudan, and the kind of testimonies that are coming, to the fore are incredible. In terms of seeing the type of policies that are being developed with Sudan by the UK and other European countries at the moment.
Good. Please, sir, stand up. If you can say your name, your affiliation, and the question.
Simon Maxwell, I used to work here. The great attraction of ODI is that it starts with empathy and emotion and then builds a research base and clear policy recommendations. And I want to ask you about a particular area of debate which is triggered by an article in the Financial Times by Paul Collier, who says that when people embark on boats from Turkey, they stop being refugees and they become migrants. And it seems to me a key issue in this whole debate is whether or not you think that Turkey is a safe space. And there are really divergent views on that. If it isn't a safe space, then there would be a case of bringing all the refugees out of Turkey and taking them somewhere else. If it is a safe space, then the case for unregulated movement across the sea then becomes much more difficult to defend. So I'd love to hear your views on that issue.
Thank you. That's a great question. And can I expand on the question? I've been, as a person working and living in Europe, I am a European citizen. I came as a student migrant. I became a European citizen. However, in covering radicalization in France, there's third generation, fourth generation French people who are still considered migrants, despite the fact that they've been born, raised, and whatever. And there's something culturally also. We can talk about Turkey, but I'd love to address the European monster here that we have at home. Please.
Well, I think
whoever wants to expand on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul Collier is coming at this from a very particular political perspective, if we're honest. I think if you actually talk to people about their experiences in Turkey, it's not true to say that everybody is unsafe. Many people have lived in Turkey for a long time, have been able to build a life. But it is also true to say that not everybody feels safe, and some people most definitely aren't. Only very recently, a young man was beheaded because he was gay. Yeah. And we have refugees in Greece who feel very unsafe about the prospects of return to that country because they don't feel as if they would be safe, and they probably have very credible fears of persecution. So I think I'm always very reluctant to generalise about whole countries or whole groups of people, or I think the situation does vary, and we have an individualised process of asylum determination in most cases anyway. But I think the idea that everybody who gets to Greece is de facto an economic migrant is not only problematic when, as I say, 90% of people come from conflict zones, but it's also problematic because it is a very simplistic dichotomy between an economic migrant and a forced migrant. And the truth is that over space and time, those barriers, those boundaries between those categories become utterly meaningless. So people from Syria told us that they left Syria because they couldn't go to work, they couldn't build a livelihood, they couldn't feed their children. Does that make them an economic migrant? No, it means that conflict has undermined their ability to have a livelihood. And that is the same for people who are living in Jordan and in Turkey too. So I think these categories of force and economic are highly problematic when we have very protracted, fragmented journeys. And frankly, we have policies that are pushing people to become refugees. The people we interviewed in Italy, many of them started their journeys in West and Central Africa with a prospect of maybe being able to support their families. By the time they got to Libya and then Italy, they were de facto refugees because of what's happening in Libya. So we can't simply put people in a category and say that they have to stay there, because they move about physically and in terms of their experience.
There's one thing that I don't understand. There is policy that's been created by the West, been exported in the Middle East, that as a byproduct created the refugees. However, we don't want to assume responsibilities. Am I missing something here? I'm sorry.
I don't think it's a recent phenomenon.
who is shared responsibility, not only because they are forced because of economic reasons, but there's instability reasons that were created. But that seems, to fall on deaf ears.
I think there's another thing too, and this shines a light on huge gaps in our humanitarian policies and the whole paradigm of refugee camps and temporary settlements, etc. The idea that somebody will flee conflict, be temporarily somewhere 6 months, the conflict will end and then they can go back. I mean, we see very clearly in Kenya we're on our 4th generation now. We are talking in so many places, 5th, 6th generation in Palestine. That paradigm itself is finished. And maybe this crisis has actually made that really clear. So over these next 2 years, when these compacts have to be developed, we have to think completely differently about what humanitarian response can be, what refugees have a right to, not just a right to shelter and safety from the elements, but rights to education, rights to livelihoods, rights to jobs. And that's where the migrant-refugee confusion comes in.
Sir, please.
Thanks. I'm Rob Williams. I run Chief Executive of War Child UK, so we work in the region with lots of children. So my question, I actually want some advice from the panelists. We know that at the summit there will be lots of talk about how much the UN is able to raise to mount a humanitarian effort. The problem that we see is that of all that aid which is raised, only 3% is spent on child protection and less than 2% on education. Even though we know that the lack of safety in camps and the lack of education is a major driver of people deciding to move from where they are. What's your advice to an NGO and our NGO colleagues in other organisations, how to get the UN to really engage with that question that aid isn't just about feeding refugees and giving them shelter, it's actually about establishing a viable and dignified way of living in a country that they haven't chosen to live in but they've been forced to move to?
Thank you, and I will take another 2 questions, please, ma'am, and I will read one from my followers online.
My name is Lorraine, and I'm from the charity Advocates for International Development. My question is more about the causes of displacement. So obviously we know that most people are displaced by war, and I was wondering if there's a shift towards talking about the responsibilities of rich states in the militarization of countries at war, and therefore the displacement of those people. In the UN summit that's coming up, is there going to be a shift towards talking about military aid and how that contributes to displacement? Obama has just promised $38 billion to Israel. That's contributing to the prolonged displacement of Palestinians, of course. is there going to be that shift in discourse maybe at the summit? And also, is ODI going to try maybe to do some research about how, or make that link more visible between militarization and military aid, particularly from rich states, and displacement?
And actually, the last question comes from our followers online. Richard is asking, how do you the experience of internally displaced people compares to those refugees, and what's being done, since little's been done towards refugees, internally displaced people in countries? Is there anything internationally that's been done to help them or not? Thank you, and please.
Just a word about children for Rob. I think actually I was happy to see Gordon Brown in his capacity as Special Envoy in Education focusing very much on issues of education for refugee children and displaced children. But one of the most shocking things about the whole European situation is that it has been Europe and the UK who have been the strongest, loudest advocates for child protection in humanitarian situations all around the world. And yet, what we see in Calais right now is just absolutely, to use Hillary's word, deplorable. And the fact that there are 5,000 unaccompanied minors from Egypt alone who disappeared in Italy last year. The fact that there are tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors throughout Europe, and we don't know where they are. We don't know whether they're being trafficked or exploited. We know they're not in schools, that's for sure. I think that is one of the most, egregious problems that we're facing here in Europe.
I think the first two questions kind of in a way are related to one another in the sense that they tell us that what's needed in responding to this situation is much bigger than just migration policies of whatever kind they might be. That this is about having a kind of global response, a holistic approach. So in some ways, having a summit for refugees and migrants extracts them from the reality of being a human being. Development, trade, arms, all of these things are intricately interconnected. And of course, government departments typically pick off different aspects of this and treat them as if they're separate, but they're not. You only have to look at the situation in Yemen, which right now is the next, well, it already is a catastrophe, but that catastrophe hasn't really hit Europe yet, but it will, because we were already interviewing people last year who were saying it was impossible to survive in Yemen. And you see there, the UK is one of the largest provider of arms that are fueling that conflict.
Actually, Theresa May recently, the newly non-elected Prime Minister, said that this is what keeps Britain safe. Actually providing arms to the Saudis, to bomb schools and hospitals in Yemen is keeping the UK safe.
In some ways, when you start to talk about it in these terms, it is some sort of Kafkaesque world, isn't it, really, where we can't, this idea that somehow you can apply the politics of the 1950s to a world which bears little or no resemblance to the one in which the convention was set up. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute the convention doesn't serve its purpose, but the interpretation or the translation of it hasn't kept with the times, and neither has this idea that actually, forget refugees for a moment. Movement in general is a part of the society and the world we live in, and most migration is happening within these regions elsewhere. So there's an out of syncness about everything. I have a question
on that. Do you get invited by policymakers, governments, to report on, to talk about these issues or to advise them on all of that? And this is where I'm shocked, actually. In 2006, I wrote a book about immigration, the experience of immigrants in Europe. That was 2006, but what drives radicalization and other issues. I've never been as a successful refugee, whatever immigrant experience, we were never, in any community, invited to advise or even to give our opinion. The other way around happened actually in the US when I arrived there. They actually listen. They might not implement, but they listen. But do they listen to you?
Listen, I'm not sure. Do we get invited? Yes, a lot, pretty much all the time. On a number of issues, we have the privilege of, briefing, ministers, times heads of state, in a number of the places where we work, very, very regularly. One thing on which we get, for instance. No, not Italy, but that's a different story. But one thing actually related to what Heaven was saying, on which I personally have been asked to advise many, many times, is precisely around this issue of status and status-related policies. And I don't know for how many years, through my personal work and research and the whole institute here, we've been trying to challenge the labels, refugee. migrant, IDP, and yet country after country, you know, the policy of providing assistance by status does not change. The IDP profiling is one of the things that sort of really depresses me the most, you know, trying to identify in a community of citizens of a certain country who is an IDP and who is not, and actually they live, you know, within communities that welcome them over extended family. And yet funding will be given according to status and not to the wider situation in which they're in.
Yes. I would like to ask Pam a question, actually, and I'd love, we give aid, and it was mentioned, military aid, and I think this is a very important issue to address. Egypt received $1 billion, Israel $38 billion in an arch of years. We give Pakistan, other countries. However, how much is given really to humanitarian aid?
Oh, I think Sarah can answer that better than I can right now. What we can say is that in most of the appeals each year for what is needed for every humanitarian situation, never, if you're really successful, you might get 65% of what is needed just to deliver basic. And some cases in Central African Republic and other places like that, sometimes it's 35%.
James, how much do you get in Kenya in humanitarian aid, let's say, for your refugees, at least to handle that one issue? James, can you hear me?
I don't have that figure. Yes, I can hear you. I don't have that figure, but largely the money goes to UNHCR because not directly to the government of Kenya. But I wanted to take up another issue of education and protection, just to say that I think this is largely the way we have structured aid, and we have structured it to have the very visible things that are well funded, you know, things like food aid and health. And yet, at the core of humanitarian action and the core of humanitarian principles of humanity, protection should be foremost. And we know very well that when any of these people as well don't get an education, as we are seeing with the Somali refugees, it becomes very difficult to go back and to settle into a meaningful life. They are not able to navigate, any of those, difficulties in becoming gainfully employed. So I think that's an important area. I think Sarah may be lucky that on the issue of being invited to talk to policymakers, we find that these are gated communities, and I think NGOs and other well-meaning people should not wait to be invited, because you wait forever. It's important to engage and to find ways to engage the policymakers. And here in Kenya, and the Kenya Red Cross has actually moved to engage policymakers at times in risky situations. So I just wanted to say that the issue of knocking down some of those gates is more important than waiting to be invited.
Thank you, James. It's actually a beautiful concept. Only a gated community could think of a policy made of closing borders and walls to block everybody else, because they benefited from the gated community, clearly. Please, these two questions. I think you have a question? Okay, my apologies. Please, ma'am. You, 1, 2, 3, then. Whoever wants to start first, I'm fine with it. Darling, here. Please, would you introduce yourself and tell?
Hi, I'm Maya with Oxfam. I just wanted to pick up on Sarah's points about status and refugees versus migrants. And the question is whether, as a sector, we are inadvertently undermining the rights of migrants in the way we're messaging on this issue. And I just want to give a very specific example. I was in Jordan last week, where there has been progress on granting the right to work for Syrian refugees. The government's issued about 26,000 work permits, is going to give more. But the way the government is selling this to the Jordanians is that these jobs aren't jobs that Jordanians would ordinarily have, and that's true. So migrants are being displaced now. The poor Egyptians, the poor Sri Lankans who are sending back remittances to their family. But I'm not sure if there is a way around this. And while I agree with the holistic approach, in theory, it does feel like there are trade-offs, but are we aware of the unintended consequences of some of our lobby?
Please, and then you.
Thank you. Marta here from ODI. In a way, Maya, you kind of stole my questions, but it's funny, it's a follow-up, because I actually would like to propose that I think as a sector, meaning analysts, advocates, commentators, though we're invited, sometimes in delegated communities to give advice, we have a big challenge at hand with this problem of the fact that we need new categories, and we need to recognize that the distinction between refugees, forced migrant, and economic migrant are more complicated than we often make, and they're blurred, and a migrant that becomes a refugee as a result of vulnerability on their journeys, which I all think that I couldn't agree more. But I think we have a major challenge ahead on how we handle all this in terms of engaging with the politics of it all, because let's recognize it, at the moment there are political gains in sticking to some of these categories to, if anything, to at least hang on to some minimum protection around the refugees categories at potentially the greater expense of what happens to the rights of migrants. So I think it's not a matter of agreeing on whether I think there's been a great debate in the media about being careful with the labels and being accurate about what you call what. But whatever we agree on the terminology, I think we need new tactics and a strategy to engage with this, because the big risk is that we lose it all. The big risk is that we lose the minimum enforcement of protection on refugees while making nowhere any progress on migration. And my worry about the summit is that we'll see the early signs of precisely that happening, where there is no progress anywhere.
And I think, ma'am, you had a question.
Yeah,
Please
it's
stand up.
Saoirse from the British Red Cross. I mean, my question relates also to trade-offs and priorities and holistic approaches. And the fact that the majority of refugees and migrants stay either within their countries or within their regions, or at least close to where their social safety nets are. And the fact that this is then used often by Western politicians as an excuse to provide aid rather than to provide international protection. And I think how we as an international humanitarian and aid community deal with that, the fact that, yes, these people do need assistance, often close to where they are, but they also need international protection. And how do we counter, as an aid community, these narratives and ensure that there is a holistic approach?
That's three brilliant questions. And I would like to just add one number, which is $4 billion a year is the number of exploitation of whether it's the people who are displaced or refugees, immigrants in Europe. That meaning somebody's making money over this tragedy. And the principle of protection is falling apart, basically. Please.
I mean, the questions are all kind of interconnected, and I think they're very big questions, and we've been asking those questions for a long time, so I'd be very surprised if we managed to crunch that particular nut in this particular session. But I think they're really important questions, and I think we really need to tackle them head on. I'd quite like to label people as human beings rather than anything else, and if there is an extra level of protection that's needed vis-a-vis persecution or conflict, then let's give people that. But essentially, we would want all of the people in our communities to have rights to be able to work, to be safe, and all of those things. There are plenty of people who are marginalised who don't even fit any of these categories. So if we started perhaps from the baseline that people have human rights and then tried to build up on that extra layers, then maybe that would be a way of not having the labels driving the debate and having people's needs and experiences and contribution paying into that. And I think the point about development assistance is a really important one in that context. But what concerns me most about the current debate is the kind of leveraging of development aid and the conditionality that's coming with that to try and persuade people to sort of effectively do what Sarah's been describing in terms of keeping people out and deterrence. So, and we talked a bit about the cartoon, but that's not really the heart of it. I mean, it's just happening very perniciously, and it's been going on since the early 2000s when Tony Blair first really proposed it. So I think we can't we can't keep on siloing this up, because if we silo up refugee protection and ignore the fact that it overlaps deeply right now with foreign policy and with trade, with development assistance and everything else, then we're going to really miss a trick. So one of the things I would really want to happen, and I know we talk about this and I know it's easier to say than do, is sectors joining together. So we don't have the refugee sector, the migrant rights sector, the development sector, the foreign aid sector. You know, this is deeply problematic because it just reproduces all of the fighting that then goes on internally between organisations for funding and everything else, and it just ignores what's the reality of what's going on. Well, we don't help ourselves or others if we're too busy trying to work out where we sit in relation to the resource pool.
I couldn't agree more with Heaven. I think that's what exactly we've tried to do. To join up the work on migration refugees, because in reality, these are mixed vulnerability for so many different people. That it's important, as you say, to look at the person and not at the label that is attached to them. And I am actually not really persuaded by the fact that we have to be careful because we may lose what we have, because that's the argument that those who don't want change are using, including our dear colleagues in the aid communities who are very protective of their mandate and structures that are obsolete, superseded, that do not match the reality of aid that we need to give today and the kind of international protection we should offer to people regardless of the label that is attached to them. So I think that's a real, a battle to fight, because at the moment, by trying to very carefully, navigating this space to try and make sure that at least refugee protections, let's face it, the convention has been broken, challenged, rejected in every way, in the letter and in the spirit. What are we, trying to hang on to when actually there is no respect of the refugee convention anyway? And so it's about actually denouncing what's happening and rethinking the categories altogether without, trying to protect mandates that are superseded.
Sarah, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just an odd example came to me. I lived in Sudan in the 1980s, and Open University had a program there where you could get masters, you could get all kinds of things, and there were lots of Eritrean and Ethiopian refugees there, and many of them took advantage of that program, and they were there for a number of years, and they were able to get a degree and get some certification and get some kinds of training. There were also resettlement programs. If you look now in Sudan, for Eritreans there, for others, there's absolutely no possibility, which strikes me as interesting. If the UK wants to actually provide some support in these places, then instead of giving support to the border guards or training to the migration control apparatus in the country, then why not provide support for things like university programs, extension programs, other kinds of training and certification, so that people, if they go home soon, we would hope that, they have gained something during that time.
I think President Obama, if I may, gave 50,000 scholarships last year, and the scholarship I arrived with to Europe, which was the policy of Europe in the 90s, was actually to empower the next generation so they can carry the work. When the Syrian war will end, and it will end one day, the Iraqi war or the Afghani war, who will build those countries will have to be educated people. Otherwise, if those are the people we left in the refugee camps, what do you think an outcome will be? What do you think what kind of country they will build? I would love governments, thinkers, and policymakers to think at that. One day they will sit in front of your kids, a grandkid, will sit in front of the president of Syria, the next president of Syria. If that president of Syria was a refugee today, sitting in a refugee camp, exploited, I am not sure what kind of policy he will produce on the ground. Please.
I was just going to say, in relation to the issue of education, but also safe and legal routes more generally, I guess, in the Syrian context. For example, the number of visas that Syrians have been granted in the UK has fallen by 50% since the beginning of the war. So gone down from 60% to 30%. Now, so many of those people who've been forced to spend all their life savings and to risk their lives to get on a boat were previously able to enter as doctors, teachers, engineers, tourists. And it's an absolute, waste of money, but it's also what it's actually doing is feeding into the, let's call it the smuggler's business model. I don't really like the terminology, but when European leaders say they want to smash the smuggler's business model, what they're actually doing is creating the demand for it. There isn't an alternative. If your borders are closed, and you could have got a visa, but now you can't. And 1 in 10 of the people that we interviewed said that they had tried to get a work visa, an education visa, or to join family members legally through family reunion, and were unable to do so because they didn't have access to those opportunities.
I mean, one of the things that, the way to frame it, maybe, if I may, I mean, the war, machine is thriving, but the way to frame it is not we are helping them. Actually, we're helping ourselves, because whatever policy you will implement or you will export or you will, build, will guarantee that in the future we'll have less radicalization and more empowering people. And we'll have less people.
Sure, but this isn't, as I've already said, I don't think this is about migration. If we looked at it rationally,
Exactly.
logically, with the evidence base, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing now. We know that. That's the only thing we do know.
I think I saw a hand. Please, sir. Yes.
My name's Martin Barber, and I'm a former UN official, retired. Just picking up on what Sarah said most recently, would the panel agree that with the debate so polarized between those who are virulently anti-refugee and immigration and those who think that everybody who is a refugee should be able to select the country to which they travel, even if in practice they are already living in a safe country of first asylum? Now, with this vitriolic and polarized debate, Sarah, could you develop a new narrative? And the narrative would build on what you just said. The fact that we all know that the Refugee Convention was drafted for a European situation in 1950 and has been universalized in a way that no longer works. And one of the elements of the new narrative surely should be that we know that refugees are not a burden when they're allowed to work. So let's stop talking about
Sir, I need
burden
a question.
sharing.
I'm so sorry
Yes,
to do this.
no,
I
the
really
question
hate
is,
myself for that, but I
will
really
you-
need the question.
Will you develop a policy that does away with the concept of burden sharing? Because it's
I mean,
asset
responsibility sharing.
Right.
Because, I'm sorry, let me correct also the words. Burden sharing, it seems, it already twists the thing. Responsibility sharing, thank you. Please, ma'am.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Sarah from the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's a fascinating discussion, thank you very much. Further to the sort of concerns regarding the Refugee Convention, I just wondered if the panel could perhaps extend those concerns to other parts of international law that are perhaps not being complied with, like international humanitarian law, and just the way in which that feeds in. I mean, I think if violations of IHL were much less, then that is another driver for people being forced to flee their homes. And just that whole discussion, unfortunately, perhaps will not play centre stage next week in New York, but it's certainly extremely relevant. I'd just be keen to hear the thoughts of the panel on that.
Great, I would start. I have a third question, and then, please.
Hi, my name's Veronica. I'm a freelance advocacy and campaigns consultant. I'd just like some thoughts from the panel about investments in the security for people who are actually already in Europe, in refugee settlements, and why and how it can be beyond the abilities of donor governments and authorities to maintain some sort of security in those areas, and if you're aware of any investments or plans underway in that regard.
Would you like to start, Pam?
With the last question, the bottom line is it's not seen as a humanitarian situation. And the policy is deterrence. There's not an interest in keeping people safe. There's an interest in discouraging people from coming into those places. So it's just a matter of different policy goals that we might have and others might have. I was really struck by Heaven's example about a Syrian who could easily get a visa 5 years ago and can't get now, so it's a kind of double jeopardy. But I also know there's an interesting sort of anticipatory discrimination. I have a young Sudanese friend who was living in Morocco, not a refugee, who got accepted into law school in France. Very brilliant guy, wanted to become a human rights lawyer, and could not get a French visa because he was told, if you come to law school in France, we think you might apply for asylum because you're Sudanese.
Yeah, James, I'd like to involve you also in this because as an African man, these are all arguments you heard before, preventive, let's say, you hear also big articles, newspaper writing about the fear of assimilation, that a black man would marry a white woman, or as Sarah mentioned earlier, the fear for the local women and other things that seems to be things used in the past. In America, I heard them a lot against African Americans. I would say they were heard maybe in the 20s, similar arguments towards minorities here in Europe. Would you like to expand on that? Thank you.
Well, I think while there's a lot written and talked about in the West, that does not just exist in the West. It also exists here in Africa. For example, there's quite a bit of discrimination against refugees from Somalia. We did not see that. Well, you notice that the border is closed in Somalia, the Somali border is closed, but the South Sudan border is open. And the argument made by the country is that, that 25 years of civil war in Somalia cannot be used, it's a very different situation from 3 years of conflict. But I think these things are there, among different ethnic groups, whether it's between Africans or Africans and others. I think the only thing is that in some of these other countries, they may be less talked about.
Sarah, would you like to expand?
I have to come up with a new narrative for the Refugee Convention. Not an easy task, but Martin, we've discussed this many times, and that relates also to the question IHL. I do believe that the time has come to have the courage to look at these documents that are very important. They've set the bar, at a time in history when it was so critical, but they are, in one case 70 years old, in the other case even more, obviously 100+ years old. So yes, absolutely they need to be rethought, rewritten, renegotiated. In one case, as you say, the Refugee Convention clearly, was, developed pretty much to respond to a European, situation. It was very specific, and the universalization hasn't worked in any possible way, and it has become more and more apparent over the last, couple of decades. In the case of IHL, it stands more in the breach, in its fulfillment. But again, if you look at how a lot of wars are being fought today, who does it apply to? This is a war made for states, and in a lot of situations, actually, what we're facing is really non-state actors fighting one another, for which the conventions, quite frankly, are not fully applicable. So we need to have the courage to renegotiate, to come back to the table. In this particular building, we advocated quite a lot about it in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit, but it was a taboo. Again, the response, the typical response is we would end up with something that is even worse. Right. Well, even worse than what? Because quite frankly, who is upholding the conventions as they are today, both IHL and the 51 Convention?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of revisiting the convention. You won't be surprised to hear, just because I think that the context right now is going to lead to something worse. So I would prefer to keep, sticking with the principles of that convention, because yes, the environment has changed. Of course it has, but the principles of it, for me, still hold. But I think the problem is it's not
the principle can hold, but there's no mechanism to eventually.
No,
if
there are
somebody breaks-
mechanisms. There is no political will, and political will can change. So once you start fiddling with the
Do
cornerstone,
you think there is mechanism to uphold certain governments who are violating?
no, I think there is
these things?
mechanisms to uphold the Refugee Convention. So don't change the Refugee Convention. Change the mechanisms that you use.
I
to
don't think
uphold
Sarah
it.
agree, and I would love to hear both of you. No, this is a very important point because it seems like everything. I mean, we're talking about one failure after another, and
Yeah,
we're
but not-
talking about renegotiating.
I don't think
and-
everything hangs on the convention. I think it's very symbolic. I think if you change that convention at this moment in time, given the politics what they are, then symbolically states would come up with something worse because it is not about refugees. So it's there's a real. You have to be really careful about which bit you try to put right and which tools you
Would
use
you
to do
add a
that.
little bit something to reinforce these principles, or you would not even put that?
I would love to have those principles reinforced, but if you think governments at this moment in time are going to add to those principles, I think they're not. They're going to remove those principles. I think we need a much more pragmatic response. I like the question earlier about responsibility sharing and how we make that happen in practice. When we talk to people about where they want to go, most people have this perception, or many people have this perception, that people, go to the countries where they'll do the best, where they'll make most money, where they'll get most welfare. It's absolutely clear from all of the evidence that the biggest driver, that if there is one, that would, lead people to be in one place rather than another, is their family. So it doesn't matter whether that family is in a country nearby, or they're in Germany, or they're in Sweden. If you talk to people about why are you going to that particular country, most people don't really have a country, but if they did, it's family. And the irony of all of this is that families can support one another. They can reduce the costs of the state. They can help the integration process. So family reunion, family reunification on a massive scale would be the most logical, pragmatic response to what's going on right now. It would stop those people crossing the water and drowning. But
Is there
that's
any
not-
policy proposal that would suggest something similar to that? Because
Well,
look, I come from a country.
Some of the Obama,
Some of the Obama.
Yeah, and the
proposals are-
EU resettlement program at the moment would say that. But it's, at the moment, the problem is that everybody knows what the solutions are on paper. It's actually getting people to deliver up and sign up to them that is the issue. And that's entirely about political will. That's not about a problem with the convention or the problem of this. It's just about wanting to do it.
Look, but also, the union is a union now. It's not one single state or one nation. It's union. And here where it's lacking. I mean, there's not a unified answer to this. There's single answers, individual answers, but not a unified one.
No, I think that the problem with Europe at the moment, it's really this crisis, and I mean, we talk about the refugee crisis, I always say it's a crisis of solidarity, but it's also a crisis of, courage and, moral and political leadership, and I think this is the real problem. And I think, we all need to think more as citizens before, policymakers and practitioners, how we, reignite this, sense of empathy and sort of solidarity for fellow human beings who are in need.
So I have Annabelle who would like to ask the panel, what do you think of partnership framework offered by the EU to third states on migration and European external investment plan launched today to boost employment and growth in countries of origins? Is that utopia or what is it?
It depends on the country of origin.
Exactly.
I don't think investment in Eritrea is going to stop people leaving Eritrea.
I don't think
I'm not
anybody's
sure
investing
investment
Yemen.
in Sudan is going to, but maybe investment in some places, which is a very fine-tuned investment, which is sure to create jobs, might help people to stay at home, and that would be a good in itself. Stopping migration should not be the overall goal. Improving livelihoods should be the actual goal.
I'd like to ask anybody in the audience, is there anybody from the media here? Would you raise questions?
Oh, James.
James, yes, James, please.
Can I say that kind of thinking, it makes an assumption that people are leaving their countries because of economics. Many of these people leaving the countries are leaving because of conflict, because of fear of losing their lives, and because of persecution. So, I mean, making more investment in a country like Somalia and in South Central Somalia, where where the Al-Shabaab is operating, and where families cannot live there in peace. It's not going to stop people
Doesn't
from
make
moving
sense.
from that.
Clearly, and I don't think anybody would invest in Afghanistan or Syria today or Yemen, let alone Iraq. Anybody from the media, can you raise your hands? This is really disappointing, I should say. Anybody that was, or an immigrant here? Or was an immigrant?
We're all immigrants.
Thank you. So I am, it has been truly an honor to chair this, and I hope we will meet in 1 year again, and the scenario and the situation will be different, but we will have all of us to work harder, much harder, in order to reshape the narrative that is dominated today on these issues by populist, xenophobic, and racist people who are rising in the polls. We will have to, as James said, not only to knock on the doors, to break down the walls and doors, and build more bridges of communication. Thank you so much for everybody that attended today, and looking forward to seeing you either in New York on the 19th or this Saturday at the, Sarah, would you like to talk about Saturday quickly?
Yes, true. On Saturday there is important refugee march. I'm sure a lot of the organizations in the room are involved in promoting it here in London. I think it starts at 12 o'clock in Hyde Park. So yes, I think ahead of the summit next week, it'll be quite important to make sure that everybody is out there, and we're all out there in great numbers. And while I have the microphone, can I also use it to thank James and everyone at the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs, because they've been a fantastic partner in the study we have done, and it would have never had the quality that it has, it does have without their involvement. So thank you, James.
I will be on Saturday, and I hope to see all of you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Heaven. Thank you, Pam. And thank you for everybody that organized this. Thank you, Paolo, and everybody from the ODI. Thank you.
Thank you.